Hi everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about the transition period between the planned socialist economy and the free market economy, which Bulgaria experienced in the 90s and also in the early 2000s. Our guest will be Jerry Schiff, IMF mission leader in Bulgaria between 2001 and 2003, and he will be able to share a lot of his experiences working with the Bulgarian government on implementing the reforms and the challenges that the mission faced. I thought that this will be of use for young people in Bulgaria and young aspiring policymakers in Bulgaria, but also maybe it will be interesting for other young aspiring policymakers from Eastern European countries or developing economies that face similar traits to the Bulgarian economy. So without further ado, let's get into the video and enjoy.
Was the head of the IMF team in Washington working on Bulgaria in the years 2001 to 2003. We had also a resident representative office, so we had somebody there on the ground, and so my job was to head the team in Washington, and we would visit, maybe 3 or 4 times a year for a couple of weeks at a time, to negotiate the economic program and then to, monitor it and, conduct other sorts of discussions. So during that time, I was mainly busy first negotiating what we call a standby arrangement, which is kind of like the meat and potatoes short-term economic program of the fund. I mean, it's the financing window. They're usually 1 year, could be a little bit more. This was going to be a successor to a program that had just been concluded. And going back a little bit further, beginning with the economic crisis in 96, 97, there had been several programs. And so this was maybe, I don't remember if it was the 3rd or 4th one after that, but yeah, it was this kind of successor. The political context was pretty interesting because we were a new team. Well, I was the new head of the team, but the government was also brand new and they were very experienced. Very inexperienced. So this was a team headed by the former king, Simeon, who came back and served as prime minister. And he brought with him a number of, at the time, very young people, a bunch of people from the financial markets in London to take positions like finance minister, deputy prime minister, and the like. So, they had the financial background, but they weren't very experienced in governing or dealing with people like the IMF. And they definitely made it clear from the beginning that they wanted to have a fund-supported program. We can talk about why they may have wanted that. And so we went to meet them, within days after they came into office. I can't remember. I feel like that was sometime in the spring, maybe. I could be wrong. Then we went back several times to negotiate the program, agree on policies and the like. I think we finally, when we took the program to the board, our executive board for approval, that was already 2002. So the discussions took a little bit of time. We can talk more about the program itself if you want. Couple of things, general points were that there were kind of two, besides the IMF's involvement, there were at least 2 other key factors that really helped determine the Bulgarian policies at the time. One was the fact that they had, and I guess still have, a currency board arrangement, a peg. And the second was that they were already looking to EU accession. And that second one became more important over time. So, the macro policies were limited by the existence of this pegged exchange rate. What they could do, what tools they had. And their sort of structural reform agenda was increasingly aimed at EU accession. So those were kind of two factors. And then maybe the third thing to general point to mention is that we worked very closely also with the World Bank at that time. The World Bank had gotten re-involved after stepping back for some period of time. And they had many sectoral missions, people coming to talk about health policy, education policy, energy policy. And they would, that's something that at least at that time was considered pretty much outside of the fund's mandate. But they would often either schedule their visits for the same time as us, or even attach one person to our team. So it was pretty close coordination. They wanted to be sure that the macro framework was solid before they went ahead. They also wanted us, they meaning the World Bank, and they also wanted us to include some of their ideas into our policy framework, to kind of push the Bulgarian authorities to adopt these policies. And that's somewhat problematic. You're not supposed to have what they call cross conditionality, but some of those reforms on the structural side were very important if the government was going to meet their macro objectives. So if you want to ask maybe like why they wanted the program,
right?
I guess there's at least maybe 3 reasons in increasing importance from the least important to the most important. I think the least important was probably the financial support. It wasn't that huge an amount. I think it was around $300 million over a year, which is not maybe peanuts for a small country, but it's not that big. And it wasn't clear at the time if they were actually going to ever draw that money. You can have the program and you don't have to even take the money if you don't want it. In the end, they did end up drawing it all, but they weren't sure at the beginning if they were going to. The second is what's sometimes called the catalytic role. So in other words, the idea that the IMF program would make it easier for them to attract financing from others, either other, bilateral donors or from the private sector. So while the fund's financing might not be very large, it might help them attract larger financing. And the third, which I think is most important, was probably political economy kinds of issues, that they felt that having the IMF's so-called stamp of approval on their policies might make it easier to get their, the required legislation through Parliament, and would kind of provide some support for them. I think, I don't remember the details, but the government did not have a very large majority. It was a coalition government, and not all the members of the coalition were particularly reform-minded. So, and not to overstate this by any means, but the IMF had a pretty good reputation in Bulgaria at that time. I wouldn't say that everybody loved the IMF, but in general, we were seen as a good partner, because the experience after 96, 97 had improved quite a bit after that, program, and after the currency board was put in place. And I even remember, the IMF had a really oddly high profile in Bulgaria. I had, worked on many countries, and that by far was the highest profile that our team ever had in my experience. And, everyone knew who we were and knew who we were on the street, and would often stop us and to talk to us. And I remember people saying, don't let those guys, meaning the government, get away with anything, or something like that, which was really shocking to me. I never had that role in any other country. So it was quite, I mean, on one hand, it was quite funny. On the other hand, I didn't really think that it was good that we had such a high profile. I mean, in an ideal world, we shouldn't, right? So it was a bit awkward.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, that's about it by way of just background. Tell you a little bit about what I was doing at that time. So I'm happy to, take it from there however you want.
Great, great. There's a few things that I think are very interesting in this. And you mentioned that the Bulgarian government even then was thinking in lines that would make it easier after that to go for EU accession. So how could they ensure that? How could they integrate this into their negotiations with you, for example?
I don't think, there was a big, again, I'm sorry, I can't give very detailed answers just because I don't recall, but, just to back up one step, I mean, the program we had with Bulgaria had basically two main parts to it, and that is the same as all the programs that came after it as well. And one was, kind of macro stability, which, given that they had a pegged exchange rate and so didn't really have a monetary policy, kind of revolved a lot around fiscal policy. And the new government wanted to do something that was quite difficult, which was to cut taxes, tax rates, increase social spending, and lower the deficit. So those three things can go together, but they don't go together that easily. So a lot of our policy discussions were around that. And the second part was just, structural reforms to kind of get, growth to be stronger on a sustained basis. So the overlap with the EU accession piece was on the structural reforms. And so, they covered issues like trade liberalization, which was, of course, big for the EU, and issues around what we called politely at the time governance, which really is mainly about, high levels of corruption and issues around privatization and things like that. So they had an agenda that they were starting to think about and put into place that was aimed at accession. We, it's not our job to, tell countries whether to join the EU or not. But of course, we saw this as an important goal for the country. And so to the extent that what they needed to do for EU accession and what we thought they needed to do, just to grow faster and what they wanted to do, I mean, there was quite a bit of overlap. So in that regard, I don't think that there was anything that we and the authorities agreed to that was problematic for the EU. So it was more just that there was a lot of overlap between what they wanted to do for the EU and what we thought they should be doing anyway.
Right.
I think there were some small issues around trade liberalization, but that was a kind of misunderstanding, I would say. We were under the impression that the EU would want the Bulgarians to begin trade liberalization, before joining the EU. And we thought that trade liberalization was a good idea at the time. So we were supporting that, but it turns out that for various kind of institutional reasons, the EU didn't want them to go very far in trade liberalization before joining or before acceding. So they were a little annoyed with us about that. But that's the only thing I remember that was kind of problematic. But as the program went on, I mean, I stayed working on Bulgaria for several years, and I would say at the beginning, the EU was not that prominent, of course, but as the time passed, it was clear that they were going to be playing a bigger and bigger role, which is, totally sensible.
Right, right. This is very interesting also because when thinking about how to set up the currency board, there have also been different options. There could be a peg to the US dollar or to the Deutsche Mark or to any other currency. So I
Right.
think one reason why they chose the German mark was actually with Eurozone accession in mind from very,
Yeah.
very long ahead. So this sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, uh, a lot of the countries that had previously been either in the Soviet Union or in the, I don't know how to call it, the Soviet bloc broadly,
Yeah.
a number of them had became currency boards or something like currency boards. And I had worked on one of them previously, which was Latvia. And Latvia was pegged to the dollar at the time. They eventually switched to the euro. And I actually worked a bit on all of the Baltic countries, and they all had pegs, and they were all different. One was dollar, one was Deutschmark, and one was a currency basket. And I couldn't figure out any good economic reason why they should have different pegs. And I just gathered it was nobody wanted to follow any of the other ones. They all wanted their own thing. But yeah, and I think, that really makes sense because, as you probably know, pegged exchange rates can go off the rails very easily. We have lots of currency crises around pegged exchange rates that sort of can't be sustained. But Bulgaria and some of these other countries had a sort of built-in exit strategy because they were all wanting to join the European Union. So, they didn't have to have this peg forever because they would eventually have it under the euro area. So I think that was very helpful in, basically strengthening confidence in the pegs and also in helping guide the country in terms of its reforms.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
I am interested in, you also said that you felt like the team was inexperienced in the beginning. So what does that mean? So how did it affect your work with the government at that time? And what does inexperience actually mean in your point of view?
Well, I mean, on one level, it's just a kind of factual description, which is that none of them had been in the government before. And so, and trying to lead a coalition government of parties that had, in some cases, very different views is very challenging. And I guess experience in politics can be useful, just like experience in anything else. In dealing with the IMF and the World Bank, maybe there was some inexperience also. I mean, I don't think that was such a big deal, but there's a process, for doing certain things, and there's a way to negotiate, and sometimes they seem not to quite they had nobody on the team that had sort of been through this before, so I don't think it was determinant in any way, but it was a little bit different. But we had really good relationship with them. I remember the first visit we came on as a team with the new government. The woman who was our resident representative there had a dinner at her house, and we were all there, and everything was very friendly, and it definitely continued in that vein, I would say. We had it was a negotiation, so there were times where we had to go back and forth, but we pretty much had, they had certain goals, and we supported those goals. So it wasn't like we were trying to achieve totally different things. So Yeah, I guess the inexperience probably was more of a problem domestically than with respect to us. Yeah.
Right.
I
I,
mean, the king was hadn't really lived in Bulgaria in many decades.
yes,
I think he had left as a small child, and I was told, of course, I can't confirm that, but I was told that he even spoke a style of Bulgarian that the average person in Bulgaria could hardly understand. So that was a
right.
pretty unusual. So, and then he was especially inexperienced in these sorts of issues. And I remember meeting with him, and he was kind of upset and very, I would say, down, like sad, because people were not just going along with what his party wanted to do, and he was getting a lot of criticism. And I guess that was something he had never faced, in a sense, because he was never a politician before. So we had to kind of try and tell him, I mean, cheer him up and say, well, this is normal in a, of course you're going to have people on both sides of the issue, so don't worry about it.
Right, right. And Bulgaria is also very turbulent politically now, probably now even a little bit more than back during those times, because during those times there were several governments that managed to serve their full terms,
Yeah.
which has not happened in some time in Bulgaria. And I'm interested in how did the political environment and maybe the political turbulence influence your work with the government? Did it have any effect? Did it change maybe the priorities across time, or how did you
I
think
don't
about
think
this?
it changed our priorities. I mean, well, we were just trying to, support the government's program to the extent that it was something we could sell to the IMF as a, board. But definitely fairly quickly, if I remember correctly, the government began to lose popularity.
Yeah,
And at some point, I don't, very soon, maybe a year or so after taking office, there was the election up for president,
hmm,
and that went to the socialist candidate.
yeah, yeah,
And even though the president, I guess, doesn't have that much, political power, it was kind of a sign that things were not going that well politically for these guys. And maybe also people start seeing them as, oh, at some point it was great. Oh, these fresh people are coming in, and they're gonna sweep out all the old corrupt politicians. But then if things don't go that smoothly, then people have another way of thinking about it, like, who are these people? They haven't even lived in Bulgaria for a while, and they're very young, and we don't, so I think that became an issue. And I think it affected their ability to do certain things. I mean, they were pretty successful in keeping the macroeconomic picture, pretty strong. They kept the fiscal deficit small, or even had maybe a balanced budget at some point, which is not easy. But it was much harder for them to do things on the structural side, because that required, legislation and getting things through parliament and getting agreement from the coalition partners. And that became harder. Once you are less popular, you have less influence over what's going on. So yeah,
right.
I think that was the main issue. So they were not able to, I mean, this is an exaggeration. I'm just, lots of things were going on, and some things did get done, but overall they were not able to push forward their structural reform program that well. And that also affected what they could do on the macroeconomic side, because I mentioned they wanted to do these three things, lower tax rates, higher social spending, lower deficit. And that required, reforming the energy sector and reforming the railways and reforming the healthcare sector. All of these things were necessary really to do what they wanted to do on the fiscal side. And also, I guess, were thought to be good ideas in and of themselves. But because they weren't able to do that, the only way they could meet their fiscal targets was by these fairly ad hoc steps, like they just held back on spending money that was actually in the budget. They developed this thing called the 90% rule, which meant that they would only spend 90% of what was budgeted each quarter until the fourth quarter, and if they had room, then they would spend it all. And this is not the kind of budgeting and spending, procedures that are, people would recommend as, first best kind of ways of, running the government. And we weren't, also not crazy about it, but that was their way to also meet their deficit targets without having done the underlying things that needed to be done.
Mm-hmm. Right,
so we kind of struggled with that throughout.
Yeah, this is a practice that actually continues to this day, or at least in the last 15 years, it has continued. So budgeting, spending way less in the first few quarters, and then having a lot of surplus at the end of the year that could be spent on large infrastructure projects, and a lot of, very often the accountability of the spending that happens at the end of the year was very heavily criticized.
For sure. Well, that's certainly related, but probably a deeper problem as well. But yeah, so I think that was in those years, that was very much a result of the inability to kind of get a little bit deeper, to find more rational ways to reduce some sorts of spending so that you could increase other sorts of spending.
Right. So something that is often, so I think by that point, the privatization program had already been very largely developed. I think it wasn't so much of a lot of the privatization efforts were already conducted through the Ivan Kostov government, which was the one before this one of Simeon. So was this still a big topic for you?
I mean, privatization was still an issue for sure. There were big companies and big public sector enterprises that were still not privatized. And I mean, a lot of them were just big money losers. And, the 96, 97 crisis was kind of all about state enterprises. So they were, losing a lot of money, and the state banks were bailing them out, and the central bank was financing the state banks. So from that point of view, it seemed important to address those underlying problems. So yeah, it was definitely still an issue. I mean, they were kind of moving ahead, but like I said, as they became less popular, they were less able or less willing to take some of these things on. Then there were issues like energy sector. They were not pricing the energy at a price that allowed them to, avoid losses, and so the ability, the quality of the energy sector was just declining. And so these are kind of typical problems, especially for countries that were still in transition in some way. And so it was really the World Bank's issue, but, they were kind of urging the government to move toward targeted subsidies. This kind of things you still talk about, right? So it's better to give subsidies to the people who need them than just charge very low prices to everybody.
Right.
And I do remember that our counterparts, like in the finance ministry and economy ministry, they were supportive of this. But when we had a meeting energy ministry, it was clear that the minister there wasn't on board at all. So, so those are the kinds of issues they had in terms of getting certain reforms across the line.
Interesting. So you managed to speak with maybe you had the opportunity to have a bird's eye view over what's happening in the government. So you were able to speak to many different ministers and maybe see the whole process of having to implement one reform, which always goes through different institutions, right? So what was your experience with how should I say, maybe the workability or the rhythm of work or the mode of work between institutions in Bulgaria, and how far is it something important for a country to be able to for there to be a lot of communication and a lot of cooperation between institutions, especially for big reforms, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always better, if you have a government that's all pulling in the same direction. But sometimes that's just not possible because of electoral politics. And you have to form coalitions with, with parties that may agree on some things, but not on others, or may not agree on very much at all, but you've made them some promises, There's nothing, I don't mean that in a shady way. I mean, this is how coalition politics work. I recall, and I don't know if this is still the situation, but there was essentially a Turkish party.
Right, yeah.
And at that time, although they only got, maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the vote each time, they often were in a kind of position of quite a bit of power because, shifting one way or another could determine who was going to win the election. And they were, for the most part, were not very interested in the kinds of reforms that the people in the finance ministry and central bank and economy ministry were interested in. And I'm guessing, that the prime minister, the former king, was not, not the type who was going to be really involved in policy discussions. Maybe if he was a stronger figure, he could have, push the different parties together, but I didn't have the impression that he was really doing that, and he was really behaving more like a king than a prime minister. I mean, in the sense of being more like a figurehead, right?
Yeah.
So I think it did limit them, but this is a very common situation. So you just have to make the best of it.
Right. There are a few interesting things that you mentioned that are kind of, especially like from my perspective, growing up in Bulgaria and also following the processes are very familiar. So especially, for example, the motive with young people coming from outside the country that haven't really lived in Bulgaria for a long time. Actually, this government was later, they called them the yuppies, which became a term which was so widespread. It was a viral term, more or less.
Wasn't the yuppies?
Yeah, yuppies. Actually, I think I looked it up, and I think it's also a term in English, but I've never heard it used in English, actually.
Yeah, it was a term in English when I was, well, maybe 30 years ago. Young urban professionals.
Yes. But I was very surprised that this term became very, very popular among basically the entire population. So this was very, very interesting. And
they were an odd fit, I guess. They did. I mean, the ones I got to know well did seem like they had sort of been parachuted into the country. I know that they did. I think they did grow up in Bulgaria, so it's not like they're not Bulgarian, but they had been, studying and living abroad for a while. Plus, they were just, very young, which is not a bad thing. Actually, in my experience, the transition countries that had younger governments tended to do a whole lot better. But
interesting.
I think the combination of being yuppies and maybe trying to do some things that were not extremely popular was a difficult combination.
Right. Actually, you may know him. I think he was deputy prime minister in the first government of the former king, Nikolai Vasilyev.
Yeah,
He
I
was
know him very well.
recently, he recently he was nominated to become prime minister very recently by one of the parties that won the election. However, yes, he again, it seemed like his ideas were not very popular among the population. So yeah, maybe it was
Yeah,
similar
he
also
he
back
was
then.
deputy prime minister, and he was minister of economy. So I think like our first meeting was probably with him as a team. Yeah, and he was very enthusiastic, and he brought the press in, which is kind of unusual because it was just like a opening meeting, and then next thing I knew, I was kind of put in front of the press to say something. Normally,
Yeah,
we do things a little bit more low-key way or something. But
yeah,
yeah, we were with him for a while, and then he moved several times to different ministries. I think he was in, they put him in the transportation ministry to deal with the railways, and then he moved to like public administration ministry. So he was all over the place. So I guess
yeah.
that means he sort of stayed in Bulgaria after he came back.
Yeah. He also started an asset management company, I think, and then he kind of tried to return to politics, but the political environment is very difficult. And actually, what happened very recently, a new party formed with people also coming from outside the country. Actually, the party founders, they were recent Harvard graduates. And it was very similar because people were also very skeptical towards them, especially because of their experience from abroad, and some of the words that they used were not very typical for everyday use in Bulgarian.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how things repeat. I find this very interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
I get the impression, just in a very superficial way, like just sort of looking through the news and the IMF's recent reports, that in broad terms the issues really haven't changed very much. Which is that Bulgaria has done a good job in maintaining relatively low fiscal deficits and debt. They've strengthened their financial system. They managed to make it through the global financial crisis and this current crisis, in relatively good shape. So their macro stability is pretty good, but they still have some of the same general issues around, structural reform,
right.
kind of improving their growth performance. And so in some ways, just glancing through these, articles and reports, I kind of felt like this sounds really familiar.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the other things that is widely discussed also by other countries recently, there was this discussion about Schengen accession, which was blocked
Yeah.
by the Netherlands. And one of the
Uh-huh.
reasons cited was corruption. So
Yeah.
maybe this was a topic that was also during the time that you were in Bulgaria. I guess it was also a very important topic, right?
Yeah, of course, it was an important topic. It's the kind of issue that's pretty hard to to address in the context of IMF program. What policies can we recommend? There are things that you can do to make it more difficult for corruption to flourish, but of course, Bulgaria is not the only country that has problems with these issues, but it affects everything. You were talking about the fact that there's a lot of issues around the quality of government spending and how the spending is allocated, and that I'm sure must be related to broader issues of governance and corruption. And if people are not paying their taxes, that often has to do with similar sorts of issues. And so it just kind of permeates through the economy and makes things much more difficult.
Yeah.
But it's
So
It's
I,
challenging.
I think like all of these things are very, very interesting for me. Also
Mm.
because they give a new perspective on what's happened. I have maybe like one more question that I find
Okay.
very
Sure.
interesting. You've had experience. You also mentioned Latvia, for example, and you've had experience in many countries. So I am interested in what made Bulgaria's case a more special case, or what differentiated the case from other ones.
Uh, well, when I started working on Bulgaria, my previous assignment had been as the head of the team on Latvia.
Mhm.
Uh, and those were my first two assignments at the IMF as a head of a mission team. And before that, I had been part of a much bigger team on Russia. So I
Oh,
was getting pretty immersed in kind of transition issues. Uh, so, well, comparing it to Latvia, I don't know if this is kind of what you're getting at, but uh, at least at that time, Latvia and the other Baltics were seen as kind of success stories among the transition countries. And then there was another group that really hadn't done anything, I mean, to reform their economies. And Bulgaria was kind of somewhere in the middle, I would say.
mhm.
So Bulgaria was quite different from Latvia in a political sense, because in Latvia, although it was also a coalition government of like many different parties, like 6 or 7 parties, there was no big difference among these parties in sort of their broad economic goals. I mean, they were extremely, they really, really didn't believe in having fiscal deficits.
Mhm.
They really wanted to privatize. They really wanted to do all these things, So they were true believers in this idea of transitioning from, central planning to market economy. And that even more than the IMF. Like I remember in 97, when there was a Russian debt crisis, that was having a big effect on a lot of economies in the region, including these Baltic countries. And the growth was slowing, and their government revenues were declining very sharply. And they still insisted that they should have a balanced budget. And we were saying, no, you don't want to have a balanced budget, because, you're having this sharp decline in revenue. It's a one-off. So you don't want to tighten fiscal policy. And that was an odd position for us to be in. And they just said, well, if we have a deficit, this year, even if we have good reason, next year people will expect us to have it again. So they were just really, really orthodox. And I mentioned age. Everyone in the government was extremely young. I mean, the governor of the central bank was probably 27 at the time,
Wow. Okay.
and ministers also extremely young. And that was, reflecting the politics, which, if you're from the region, so you probably understand that everybody that had anything to do with the previous regime in the Baltics was just kicked out.
Yes.
Where
Yes.
in other countries that was not the case, right? So you still had people in the government who maybe pined for the good old days, but
Mhm.
not in the Baltic countries. So that made the political environment very different. Of course, they're also really small countries. Bulgaria is a significantly bigger country and maybe more diverse economy and more complicated in that sense. Yeah, they all had pegged exchange rates, and they all did pretty well on maintaining, macro stability. But I guess the Baltic countries were able to move forward faster on these kind of structural reforms, and their growth performance has overall been a lot better. Well, until the last few years, I don't follow it anymore. So, but at least for a number of years, they were growing very rapidly and converging quite rapidly to, the countries
Yes.
that were already part of the EU.
Yes, yes, that's still
I
true to
think
this day.
Bulgaria's convergence is a lot slower.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's slowing. Yeah, and some processes that were supposed to be much faster, for example, the Euro area accession or the Schengen accession, are delayed with many years. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I would have guessed, at that time that the time between EU accession and Euro area accession would have been much shorter,
Mm, yeah,
because Bulgaria had a lot of experience, with a pegged exchange rate pegged to the euro. So that's, there, you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of concern about them being part of the euro from that point of view. But I guess they have
right,
other issues.
right. And that's why I asked previously about cooperation between institutions, because it feels like there's still just different institutions pulling in different directions, or not in the same time horizon, or not with the same speed, and this makes everything much more complicated.
You're talking about institutions domestically or like international institutions?
Domestically, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just don't, I mean, I do follow when I see something, an article that has Bulgaria in it, I will definitely read it, but I don't follow it,
Yeah,
on a
right.
daily basis. But I
Yeah,
do feel, still a really, I feel some kind of strong connection to that country. I made a lot of friends there, and saw a good part of the country, driving around, and I really, you start to feel some connection, not just because it's your job, but
right.
you want good
Yeah,
things to happen.
yeah, right. Random question, but is
Yeah.
it? Do you have a memory or something that you particularly liked about Bulgaria?
I liked a lot of things about it, really. I remember this, I mean, outside of work, some of the travel I did in the country was really special. We went to is it Bansko,
Mhm.
the ski
Ski
resort
resort.
area?
Yeah.
And that was before it had, I understand that now it's been quite built up, but at the time it really had this really nice atmosphere of this kind of small town, small village. And I just remember, walking around at night and this really crisp air, and eating really good food, and sleeping in these, they call them taverns, I think, but they're not taverns. They're like little, inns, something like that. And then I
Yeah.
remember that I guess one of the reporters had seen us all walking down the street in Bansko. And then on Monday morning, there was an article saying that the IMF had gone to Bansko to inspect the progress on the new ski lift, which is completely made up. We just went there for fun. So, I don't know what kind of inspection they thought we could do, but so made me realize that we have to be on our best behavior at all times, because people
Right.
just notice us.
I think this illustrates
Um,
very well what you said about trust in you being very high. Maybe they were more probably thinking that you expect every corner of the country.
yeah, and even I had the experience that one time after I was in Bulgaria, I went, I took some leave afterward, and I went to Istanbul. And apparently somebody from Bulgaria saw me just doing tourist things in Istanbul, and then I heard from somebody else, "Oh, I heard you were in Istanbul." So,
Interesting,
it was
interesting.
really, because
Yeah,
we're just kind of technocrats, and we're not used to getting a lot of attention, so it's kind of startling when it happens.
yeah. Understand. That's interesting.
But
Cool.
yeah, yeah. Well, I hope this was of some use to you.
Absolutely, I think so. I think it provided a very valuable perspective also from the outside, and how you read, how you look at different processes that can be seen even to this day in Bulgaria. So for me, that was super, super interesting. And I really, really want to thank you for your insights and your stories. And I think, yeah, I benefited a lot. And I think a lot of young Bulgarians who are interested in all of this will be very, very interested too. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And in the future, we're going to talk about a lot of other topics concerning Bulgaria, Bulgaria's development, and young people in Bulgaria. So see you soon.